you were going to say something about China.
We never had any particular desires to go to China. In fact, we knew that we'd never go to China on our own. But we got asked by some British cavers if we would want to go on a trip with them to China. Mainly
UNESCO.
Yes, it was mainly going to be a UNESCO trip to assess the viability of a national heritage site. And they wanted to apply for that status with this beautiful karst area. They thought it really was worthy of UNESCO heritage status. And so we were among a couple of Americans invited. Most of them were from Britain, others were from other countries around the world. And Will White and Bet White were the two other Americans. Stayed over in Hong Kong, and then we were picked up and flew to Chongqing, which is the old capital of China back in the good old days. And they had arranged places for us to stay. And our place to stay in Chongqing was a hotel. I paced it off, and it was 60 paces, was it, or was it 50 paces from one end of our suite to the other? And it was just a magnificent place. They had pulled out all the stops to impress us, apparently, and they did very well. And so we went from there down south to the heart of the karst territory, and had 2 weeks available to visit some of the grandest caves and pits and waterfalls and things of that particular area. And it was a wonderful trip. Everybody got along fabulously.
Tiancong.
Yes, and the big story of the trip was what are called Tiancong, is Tiankenj, Keng. I think that's how it's spelled. But anyway, they were unheard of anywhere else in the world. And so we were supposed to assess these as being great places to visit. And they were great for us to visit because we were enchanted. We went to a place where there was a hole in the ground. And it was about from here to our drive, to the end of our driveway in diameter. In other words, about a couple 100 feet and in diameter, and much deeper than that. And the curious thing was that there was this cable going across from one end to the other, along the top from one end to the other. It looked as though they were trying to keep the thing from splitting apart, and the whole earth would drop into two pieces along this line. And it was way over 600 feet deep and had a huge river coming out of it, disappearing into breakdown and so forth, and going on farther downstream. Well, we assessed the status of that and said, this is indeed a magnificent place, photos and all that sort of thing. And it turns out that that passage that we could see into had been explored by the British in an earlier year. They had gone through it, and the river was so big, so intensely turbulent, that if you dropped anything into the water, it would just go all the way to the bottom. Even if it was something that would float in normal water, it would just go all the way to the bottom, because it was just froth. And the explorers, the British explorers in the previous year, had to traverse through this whole thing using bolts in the walls. They got only halfway through one year, and they came back the next year and they found out that all of their bolts had been shaved off clean to the wall by the turbulent water during the winter time. rocks and boulders and so forth beating against them. And they finally got through all the way from the upstream end to the downstream end. And there are some people who never went caving again after that experience. The thing is about 600 feet high, and just a horrible experience, but a beautiful place to visit. Cave geology.
Cave geology.
I've heard of that, yes. I was asked to write this book by the Cave Research Foundation, and it was edited by Roger McClure, who was a Cave Research Foundation member of long standing. And so I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so I spent a couple of years pasting this together, and it involved a lot of pulling together things that I already knew, which is kind of nice if you're going to write a book about something. You got to know something about it to begin with. And so I went on, and it grew and grew, and it ended up to be a fairly popular book. And it just went into its 5th printing earlier this year. This just sort of put together all that I knew about cave geology.
Has there been anything in that book that you've revised your thinking on since you wrote it?
Yeah, there's a list of long caves, and that's changed. But to answer your question more seriously, I did find a couple of things that needed changing. No technical aspects to speak of, but I did adjust a few things and make things a little bit clearer in the subsequent printings. But basically, it's all the same edition. There's no difference between this and the latest edition, except for a few things at the end where I'm talking about survey techniques that today people are using distos and that sort of thing, and using computer programs. That wasn't the case when I wrote this.
Yeah, the disto survey is sure a lot easier now than it was, certainly even with the Santos, and if you go back to the Bruntons, it's enormously easier than the Bruntons.
Yes, I know. And I have illustrations here of Bruntons being used and distos and so forth, but the equipment that's available today just outpaces those. And it's pretty good. We've got all of those pieces of equipment ourselves, and they work. We've gone a bit beyond that with tripod-mounted instruments that you can sight through, just like with a camera, and you focus on a certain spot and just push a button, and it will give you the distance and the vertical inclination and the horizontal direction all in one shot. And then you flip it around and do it again with the instrument upside down just to make sure that it's not wrong.
Well, that's good if you've got room enough to put that instrument in your cave passage.
Well, actually, we have brought that through crawlways and so forth. Did a lot of Crystal Cave with that. Crystal Cave has this long crawlway that's infamous for ripping people apart. But with this instrument, you can put it in a small case, and the tripod goes along with you. You don't try to put that in the case, but you have select somebody else to carry the tripod, and it works out surprisingly well.
Let's talk about maze caves. Let's talk about Anvil Cave. Convince me that tell me what your interpretation of how Anvil Cave formed is, and convince me that you're right.
Okay, well, this is really a long time ago, and there are 2 ways to form a maze cave like that. Actually, more than 2. But Anvil Cave fills 2 of those slots, maybe even 3. But one thing is if you have sandstone overlying limestone, the sandstone will not dissolve particularly, and so you have water descending down through the sandstone. The sandstone is pretty permeable, at least along joints and so forth, and sometimes even all through the matrix of the rock itself. But let's just say that it's the joints that control the water flow. So you have water going down through the sandstone caprock into the limestone, and the joints tend to be coincidental, where you have a fracture in the sandstone, the fracture will continue in the limestone below. And so you have water dribbling down and hitting the limestone and enlarging that joint. And so you end up with a fissure type passage. Now if that happens along all of these joints, you end up with a network pattern. And so it's a cave that has formed not by water falling, discharging into a single hole and then coming out another hole, but instead dispersing through the whole limestone formation itself.
How do you get that even of distribution in all of the joints in the sandstone so that it comes down into the limestone?
It's just the way it works, because you have this big block of resistant material. Just imagine taking a slab of concrete that's been deposited maybe in a couple of layers, a big slab of concrete, and then you fracture it by the tectonic forces within the earth, where you've got forces pressing from the side, possibly forces upward and so forth, and cracking the rock. The rock doesn't just crack in an erratic way. It tends to crack along zones of weakness. And so if you take a rock like this and you try bending it, you're going to end up with a lot of fractures that go parallel to each other like that. And so you tend to have major joints going in one direction, and then you'll have splitting of the rock in the other direction too, so you'll have sort of a crisscross pattern. And one of them being a major direction where the large passages go, and the other being sort of the cross passages that take you from one major passage to the next. And so that's one way of doing it. If you don't start off with limestone like that, but you have limestone with no cover at all, then it's a little bit more difficult. You could have the limestone being bent by stresses within the earth, just folding and uplift and that sort of thing. And so you end up with a tendency for joints to be parallel to each other in one major direction, and then the minor direction would be cross passages, cross joints. And so what the cave represents is just simply an enlargement of those cracks that were there to begin with. The trick is to get the water to follow not a single direction, path of least resistance, but to follow all of those. The best way to do that is to have a nice permeable rock above where the water can seep down through, sort of like going through a strainer, and then down into the limestone. And that's how Anvil Cave formed. And just about all of those caves look the same.
Where's the source of the water that's feeding into the sandstone at Anvil Cave? Where's it come from?
Actually, two different directions. You would have the water infiltrating from above, and you'd have the water coming in from the river. Every time there's a flood, the water would fill the cave. And so both of those processes are conducive to making a white maze cave. The water trickling down from above is dispersed pretty evenly throughout the limestone. It'll follow all the cracks, and not every crack has the same amount of water passing through it, but they all have some water passing through. And the few that have all the most of the water flowing through them will turn into the major passages, and the minor ones tend to be there too, but they'll tend to take their place, and then with time they enlarge. Another source of the water would be water coming in from the creek. So you've got, every time there's a flood, the water will flood into the cave and just enlarge the cave, sort of like going in and cleaning house. And so you got those two sources of water doing pretty much the same thing. The flooding tends to enlarge what's already there, and the seepage from above tends to produce the original openings. And hence you end up with a cave like Anvil.